Bear attacks, though rare, can be dangerous and often result from human encounters that trigger a bear's defensive or predatory instincts. These attacks typically occur when a bear feels threatened, surprised, or protective of its cubs or food. Understanding bear behavior and taking precautions can significantly reduce the risk of an encounter turning aggressive. Hikers and campers should stay alert, make noise, and carry bear spray in bear-prone areas. Knowing how to react appropriately, whether facing a grizzly or black bear, can mean the difference between safety and serious injury. Here are 6 tales. On March 10, 2025, the remote Siberian village of Verkhoyansk, known for its record-breaking cold temperatures and rugged wilderness, was shaken by a horrifying event. Nestled deep within the Sakha Republic, Verkhoyansk had long been accustomed to harsh winters and the presence of formidable wildlife. But nothing could have prepared the residents for the tragedy that unfolded that morning at the village's only post office. The day began like any other, with locals trudging through the snow-covered streets to collect letters, packages, and pension payments. The small, aged building that housed the post office stood near the village center, a modest wooden structure with a single entrance and a few narrow windows frosted over from the inside. The postmaster, Yevgeny Burkov, a retired railway worker, unlocked the door at precisely 9 a.m., as he had done every morning for the past 12 years. Villagers filed in, exchanging greetings and idle gossip as they waited in line for their turn at the counter. Among the visitors was Antonina Vyalkova, a widow in her 70s who never missed a day at the post office, hoping for a letter from her granddaughter studying in Moscow. Next in line was Igor Maleshkin, a construction worker who had come to pick up a parcel from his brother in Novosibirsk. Behind him stood Vadim Krushenkov, a reclusive trapper who rarely ventured into town except when necessary. 2 younger men, Andrei Zubarev and Maxim Fokin, engaged in a quiet discussion near the door, while a woman named Polina Gromova, a local teacher, flipped through a magazine she had picked up from a nearby rack. Outside, the temperature remained unforgiving, hovering at around -32 degrees Celsius. A few villagers walked by, their faces wrapped in scarves, oblivious to the danger that lurked in the nearby forest. Unbeknownst to those inside, hunger and desperation had driven a massive grizzly bear, a rare sight so deep into winter, from the wilderness into the heart of the village. The beast had been roaming the outskirts for days, drawn by the scent of livestock and waste bins. Malnourished and agitated, the bear had been rummaging through the remains of a recently abandoned fishing shack, but the lack of food had only heightened its desperation. At about 9:30 a.m., the door of the post office swung open again. The scent of human presence, warmth, and possibly food greeted the animal as it lumbered into the building. The moment was surreal. At first, the villagers assumed it was some kind of joke or a hallucination caused by the cold. But when the massive beast rose onto its hind legs, its fur caked with frost and its breath steaming in the warm air, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to sheer terror. The bear wasted no time. With a guttural roar, it lunged forward, swiping at the nearest person, Antonina Vyalkova. The elderly woman was struck with such force that she was thrown against the wooden counter, her frail body crumpling instantly. Blood splattered across the walls as the bear turned its attention to Igor Maleshkin, who had instinctively raised his arms in a feeble attempt to defend himself. The beast's claws ripped through his coat and into his flesh, and he fell to the ground in agony. Panic erupted. Vadim Krushenkov, accustomed to facing wild predators, reached for the hunting knife at his belt, but the bear was faster. A powerful swipe to the head sent him sprawling, his skull cracking against the wooden floor. Andrei Zubarev and Maxim Fokin tried to rush toward the door, but the bear was in their path. It lunged at Maxim, sinking its teeth into his shoulder and dragging him down as he screamed for help. Andrei managed to reach the exit, but in his haste he slipped on the icy threshold, falling hard on his back. The bear wasted no time in finishing him off. Polina Gromova, the last remaining person inside, pressed herself into the corner, hands clamped over her mouth to keep from screaming. The bear, now frenzied by the scent of blood, turned toward her, but before it could advance, the sharp wail of a siren pierced the air from outside. Someone, likely one of the passing villagers, had heard the commotion and raised the alarm. The sound startled the bear, and it let out a deep, irritated growl before turning and bolting out the door, disappearing into the white expanse of the forest. By the time rescue teams arrived, the post office was a bloodbath. 6 bodies lay motionless on the floor, their lifeless expressions frozen in shock and horror. Only Polina remained alive, still cowering in the corner, her face drained of color. The aftermath was nothing short of devastating. News of the attack spread quickly across Russia, shocking the nation and prompting an urgent review of wildlife management policies in remote areas. Experts later analyzed the attack and speculated that the bear had been forced out of its natural habitat due to severe food shortages caused by an unusually prolonged winter. Reports indicated that a decline in the local deer population had left predators struggling to find sustenance, leading them to wander into human settlements. Wildlife specialists warned that such incidents could become more frequent if environmental conditions continued to deteriorate. The residents of Verkhoyansk mourned their dead, their sense of security shattered. The post office remained closed for weeks, its doors sealed as a grim reminder of the tragedy. Yevgeny Burkov, the postmaster, retired soon after, unable to step foot in the building again. Survivors and relatives of the victims demanded action, calling for better protective measures. But deep down, they knew that living in the wilderness meant coexisting with its dangers. The bear was never found. Hunters were sent into the forest, tracking its prints for miles, but it had vanished into the vast Siberian wilderness, leaving behind nothing but terror and the memory of that fateful morning. Even years later, villagers would still speak of the day the grizzly bear came to the post office, a chilling tale whispered around fires on the coldest nights. The wind howled through the towering pines of Kodiak Island, Alaska, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth. The year was 2014, a time before the island saw the boom of modern tourism. The wilderness remained untamed, its ecosystem ruled by the formidable Kodiak bears, creatures that could weigh up to 1,500 pounds and were known to be fiercely territorial. The island had a reputation for being both a paradise for fishermen and a land of lurking dangers. David Lonsdale had been fishing these waters for years, and each trip had only cemented his deep respect for the land and its perils. A seasoned fisherman in his early 40s, he had spent the last 3 days camping near Karluk Lake, enjoying the solitude and abundance of salmon. His small weathered boat bobbed gently on the cold water as he pulled in yet another heavy catch, the pink and silver scales gleaming under the dimming afternoon sun. As he prepared to pack up for the evening, his sharp eyes caught movement along the tree line. At first, it was just a shadow between the thick trunks, but soon the form became unmistakable. A massive Kodiak bear had been drawn to the scent of the freshly caught fish. The creature's dark, matted fur clung to its hulking frame, and its powerful limbs moved with a slow, deliberate grace. David had encountered bears before, but none this size and certainly none this close. His first instinct was to remain still. He had learned long ago that running was a fool's mistake, but the bear's gaze was fixed on his boat, its nostrils flaring as it inhaled the rich scent of fish. David calculated his options quickly. He could attempt to scare it away, but that carried its own risks. Instead, he made a choice he would regret for the rest of his life. With slow, careful movements, he lifted one of the largest salmon from his haul and tossed it toward the shoreline in an attempt to placate the bear. The fish landed with a wet slap on the pebbled bank, its body still twitching. The bear hesitated, sniffing the air for a brief moment before it lumbered forward and snatched up the offering. David exhaled, thinking he had successfully avoided a dangerous encounter, but the bear was not satisfied with a single fish. It lifted its massive head, black eyes locking onto him with a new hunger. The fisherman realized his mistake too late. By offering food, he had signaled to the animal that there was more to be had. The bear took a step into the water, then another. Before he could react, it surged forward with terrifying speed, its bulk sending waves crashing against the boat. The impact was immediate. The bear's claws raked across the side of the boat, sending David sprawling backward. His world became a blur of splintering wood and churning water as he was thrown overboard. The cold hit him like a fist to the chest, his lungs seizing as he struggled to right himself. But the bear was relentless. It lunged, its massive paw swiping at him just as he managed to grab hold of a floating plank. Pain exploded across his back as the claws raked deep gashes into his flesh. He gritted his teeth and fumbled for the fishing knife strapped to his belt. His fingers, numb from the icy water, barely managed to wrap around the handle before the beast was upon him again. With a desperate thrust, he drove the blade toward the bear's snout. The tip barely pierced its thick hide, but it was enough to make the creature recoil, shaking its head with a deep, guttural growl. Seizing the opportunity, David kicked with all his strength, propelling himself toward the shore. His legs burned as he dragged himself onto the rocky bank, blood mixing with the water dripping from his clothes. The bear hesitated for a moment, then let out a frustrated huff before turning back toward the boat, tearing into the remaining fish with brutal efficiency. David forced himself to move, each step sending jolts of agony through his battered body. He knew he had little time before the bear lost interest in the fish and turned its attention back to him. His camp was a quarter-mile away, nestled between a cluster of trees, and the trek felt impossibly long. Every breath came with a sharp stab of pain, but he pressed on, using the trees for support. When he finally reached his tent, his vision blurred, and his hands trembled as he rummaged through his gear. A small first aid kit was his only saving grace. He tore open a packet of gauze, pressing it against the worst of the wounds. The pain was white-hot, but he forced himself to keep going, using a roll of duct tape to secure the makeshift bandages in place. It was crude, but it would have to do. The night stretched on in agonizing silence. Every rustle of leaves sent a fresh wave of paranoia through him. He clutched his knife, his exhausted mind wavering between vigilance and delirium. By dawn, his wounds were stiff, his body feverish, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. With slow, calculated movements, he packed up his camp. The journey back to civilization would be grueling, but he knew he couldn't stay. The bear had learned that humans could provide food, and that knowledge made it even more dangerous. As he limped toward the nearest trailhead, he swore to himself that he would never make the same mistake again. Kodiak Island had taught him a brutal lesson. Respect was not given in the wilderness, it was demanded, and those who failed to acknowledge its laws paid the price in blood. In the autumn of 2016, 3 lifelong friends, Benedict Ben Halverson, Jacob Jake Whitmore, and Marcus Ellsworth, set off on what they hoped would be an unforgettable adventure along a remote section of the Appalachian Trail. The section they chose, deep in a forest in North Carolina, was known for its rugged beauty, towering hardwoods, and isolation. It was precisely what they sought, an escape from the relentless hum of city life, the suffocating schedules, and the constant weight of expectations. The Appalachian Trail had long been a favorite among hikers, but the section they chose saw fewer visitors, particularly in the later months of the year. The area's remoteness, combined with the thick undergrowth and unpredictable terrain, made it both beautiful and treacherous. It was the kind of place that demanded respect. Locals often shared tales of mysterious disappearances and eerie encounters, but the 3 friends dismissed them as nothing more than campfire stories meant to spook outsiders. Their journey began on an unusually warm October morning. Laden with backpacks filled with provisions, they hiked through rolling hills blanketed in a patchwork of red, orange, and yellow foliage. The occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded them they weren't alone, though the likelihood of running into anything dangerous seemed low. The most they expected were glimpses of deer or perhaps a curious fox. As the sun dipped below the tree line on the first evening, they found a picturesque spot near a slow-moving river to set up camp. The gurgling water and the crisp night air made for an ideal setting. They followed proper hiking protocol, hanging their food high in a tree to deter any wildlife from sniffing out their supplies. They sat around a small fire, eating canned chili and sharing old stories. The world felt wonderfully distant. But as the night stretched on, an unease settled over them. A distant snap of twigs, the faint but distinct sound of something moving through the underbrush. Initially, they brushed it off as normal forest noises, perhaps a raccoon or a wandering deer. But the sounds grew closer, more deliberate. Heavy footfalls, a deep guttural huff, a black bear. It was common knowledge that black bears usually avoided human confrontation, preferring to scavenge for food rather than engage in aggression. But this bear, this one felt different. It was bold. It was hungry. Jake, always cautious, suggested retreating into the tent and waiting it out. Ben, more adventurous, proposed making noise to scare it away. Marcus, often the voice of reason, argued for something in between, keeping their distance while gauging the bear's behavior. The decision was made for them. A shadow moved just beyond the fire's glow. The bear emerged from the darkness, massive and unrelenting. Its dark eyes locked onto them. It sniffed the air, its large, wet nose catching the scent of their food. Its fur was matted, its ribs slightly visible, a sign of desperation. They stood frozen, hearts hammering. The bear first went for the tree where their provisions were hung. It reared up, powerful claws raking against the bark, swiping at the dangling bag. But when it realized the food was out of reach, its attention shifted to them. With terrifying speed, the bear charged. It was faster than any of them could have imagined. Ben, who had always considered himself quick on his feet, barely had time to react before the beast was upon them. A heavy paw struck him, claws tearing into his shoulder and sending him sprawling onto the forest floor. His scream was sharp and primal before cutting off as the wind was knocked from his lungs. Panic surged through Jake and Marcus. Instinct kicked in. Marcus grabbed the nearest branch, a pitiful defense against such raw power. He swung, striking the bear's thick hide, but it did little more than enrage it further. The bear turned on him, swiping in a blur of motion. The impact sent him crashing backward, blood immediately darkening his shirt. Jake, the only one still standing, scrambled for the backpack, hoping to grab a knife, anything. But the bear was upon him before he could react. It barreled into him, teeth sinking into his thigh. The pain was immediate and excruciating. He kicked and thrashed, but the bear was relentless. The taste of blood had set something off inside the beast, a frenzied need to dominate, to consume. For what felt like an eternity, the forest was filled with the sounds of struggle, grunts of effort, the tearing of flesh, the desperate gasps for air. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the attack ceased. The bear, breathing heavily, its muzzle stained crimson, stepped back. No one would ever know whether it was satisfied, tired, or simply uninterested in finishing what it started. It lumbered back into the woods, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. Silence settled over the clearing. Days later, a search and rescue team, responding to frantic calls from family members who hadn't heard from the hikers, found the gruesome remains of their camp. The scene was harrowing. The fire long extinguished, the tent torn and flattened, the riverbank marred by dark trails of blood. The bodies of Ben, Jake, and Marcus lay scattered within the area, their injuries horrifyingly consistent with a bear attack. The story of the attack spread quickly, fueling debates about wildlife behavior and hiker safety. But this was not just a tale of an unseen tragedy. A lone witness, another hiker named James, camping a short distance away, later came forward and revealed everything to the rescue team. He had heard the screams, the frantic shouts, the guttural roars of the bear. Too far and too afraid to intervene, he had watched through the trees as the monstrous silhouette moved through the firelight, the struggle unfolding in flashes of chaos. By the time he mustered the courage to approach, it was too late. Despite efforts, the bear was never found. The trail remained open, but hikers approached the area with newfound caution, and the witness, though spared from the carnage, carried with them the weight of what they had seen. A chilling reminder that the wilderness is vast, untamed, and indifferent to those who enter its domain. The year was 2018, and the crisp autumn air had begun to settle over a wilderness area in Montana's Rocky Mountains. The vast expanse stretched endlessly, a rugged tapestry of alpine meadows, dense coniferous forests, and jagged mountain peaks capped with early snow. Wildlife thrived here, from elusive mountain lions to ever-present black bears, but none commanded as much fear and respect as the grizzlies. Alex Mercer had always been an outdoorsman. A seasoned hiker, he had traversed trails across the country, and yet this trip was different. His teenage daughter, Sophie Mercer, had recently turned 16, and he saw this as an opportunity to bond with her. One last adventure before she would inevitably drift into adulthood, where time with her father would become scarce. Sophie, on the other hand, was less enthusiastic about the idea. Though she appreciated nature, she had little patience for long hikes and had been reluctantly dragged along. Still, as they trekked deeper into the heart of the park, even she had to admit there was something majestic about their surroundings. The trees towered high above, and the golden hues of fall painted a breathtaking picture against the crisp blue sky. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The hike had been uneventful for most of the day. They followed the trail along a narrow ridge, stopping occasionally to admire the scenery or drink from their canteens. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows through the trees, when Alex made the decision to push forward a little farther before heading back to their campsite. He reasoned that reaching a particular vantage point just beyond the next hill would make the entire trip worthwhile. As they rounded a bend, they found themselves in a small clearing speckled with wild berry bushes. Sophie moved ahead, brushing her fingers against the leaves, when Alex's hand shot out to stop her. There, not more than 20 feet away, a massive grizzly bear was hunched over, tearing at the ripe fruit with deliberate swipes of its powerful claws. The beast's fur was thick, matted in some areas, and its muscles rippled beneath the shaggy coat as it fed. Every fiber of Alex's being told him to stay still. He knew grizzlies weren't naturally aggressive unless provoked or startled, but their presence alone demanded caution. He whispered for Sophie to step back slowly, but her boot caught on an exposed root before she could react. She stumbled, and the sudden crunch of branches beneath her shattered the quiet air. The bear's head snapped up. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and oppressive. Then, in a blur of motion, The grizzly reared onto its hind legs, standing to its full, terrifying height. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from its throat, vibrating through the air like distant thunder. Its dark eyes locked onto them, and in that instant, Alex knew they were in trouble. Before either of them could react, the bear charged. Adrenaline surged through Alex's veins. He instinctively positioned himself between the bear and his daughter, gripping his trekking pole like a feeble weapon. He barely had time to brace himself before the grizzly was upon him. A swipe from its massive paw sent him sprawling to the ground, pain erupting across his chest as he hit the dirt. The bear loomed over him, its breath hot and pungent, a mixture of earth and raw meat. Sophie, paralyzed for a split second, fumbled at her backpack. Her fingers trembled as she grasped the canister of bear spray her father had insisted she carry. She had never used it before, and the safety clip seemed impossibly difficult to remove. Meanwhile, Alex fought to keep the bear's attention on him, using what little strength he had to push himself away, but the grizzly was relentless. It lowered its head, its sharp teeth bared, preparing for another strike. Finally, Sophie managed to disengage the clip. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, she aimed and pressed down on the nozzle. A thick, burning mist erupted from the canister, enveloping the bear's face. The reaction was immediate. The grizzly let out a deafening roar, shaking its head violently as it stumbled backward. Its massive paws clawed at the air, trying to rid itself of the searing irritation in its eyes and nose. Alex seized the moment to scramble away, dragging himself towards Sophie. His ribs ached, and his vision blurred from the impact, but survival instincts overrode the pain. Now disoriented and unwilling to continue the attack, the bear let out a final angry huff before turning and lumbering back into the trees. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie's hands were still clenched around the bear spray, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Alex lay on his side, wincing at the sharp pains radiating from his chest. They had survived, but just barely. With effort, Alex sat up and assessed the damage. His shirt was torn and his torso bore the angry red marks of the bear's claws. Miraculously, nothing was broken, though he knew he'd be feeling the pain for weeks. Sophie, though shaken, was unharmed. They didn't waste another second. With cautious but swift steps, they began their retreat down the trail, never once looking back. Every sound, every rustling leaf sent their nerves into overdrive, but the bear did not return. They allowed themselves to breathe again when they reached the familiar site of their campsite. As they sat by the fire that night, the reality of what had happened fully set in. The grizzly had been a force of nature, a reminder that the wilderness was not theirs to control. Alex realized just how close they had come to disaster, and for the first time he questioned whether he had made the right decision in bringing Sophie out here. Yet as he looked at her, seeing the strength in her eyes and the way she carried herself differently now, he knew this experience had changed them both. For her part, Sophie no longer saw her father as just the unshakable, infallible man she had always known. He had been a vulnerable human, yet protected her without hesitation. Once strained by teenage defiance, the bond between them had been reforged in those terrifying moments. As they packed up the following day, Alex took one last glance at the towering trees and the vast, untamed wilderness. The grizzly's warning had been clear. This was its domain, and they were merely visitors. With a newfound respect for the wild, father and daughter left the park, forever changed by the encounter that had nearly cost them their lives. In the winter of 2012, the Arctic ice fields of northern Canada stretched vast and unforgiving, a desolate expanse of white and blue, where the silence was as deep as the cold itself. This was no place for the unprepared, yet for a team of researchers led by Dr. Rachel Moore, it was home for the next 6 weeks. The group, composed of climatologists, biologists, and glaciologists, had been tasked with studying the effects of climate change on Arctic ice sheets. Their base camp was a cluster of insulated tents near Ellesmere Island, set up strategically close to known migratory routes of polar bears. An experienced glaciologist, Dr. Moore had handpicked her team for their expertise and resilience. Among them were Dr. Elias Vinter, a marine biologist specializing in Arctic fauna, Ingrid Sorel, a seasoned field technician, and Jules Darnell, a young but brilliant climatologist. There were also 2 local Inuit guides, Tuktu Aningen and his nephew Kino, who had been instrumental in navigating the treacherous terrain. The team worked tirelessly, collecting ice core samples, documenting temperature shifts, and observing climate change's subtle but devastating effects in real time. Despite their meticulous planning, one critical mistake was made: securing their food supply. The team had set up a reinforced storage unit a short distance from their main tents, but in their exhaustion, they neglected to seal a few of their containers properly. The Arctic wind carried the scent through the frozen wasteland, and the consequences were dire in a region where food was scarce. On the 10th night of their expedition, the first sign of danger emerged. Tuktu noticed deep tracks in the snow near the camp perimeter. The prints were unmistakable. Polar bear. He reported the sighting to Dr. Moore, who took immediate precautions, issuing flares and ensuring that bear deterrents were in place, but it was not enough. The bear had caught the scent, and hunger made it desperate. The attack came in the dead of night. The researchers were huddled in their tents, bundled in layers against the biting cold, when a deep guttural sound echoed through the camp. A heavy thud followed as something massive brushed against one of the storage units. Then came the sharp tearing of fabric, the unmistakable sound of metal bending under incredible force. Dr. Moore was the first to emerge from her tent, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. What she saw sent a wave of ice through her veins. A massive male polar bear, its fur matted and dusted with frost, was rifling through their supplies. As she fumbled for her flare gun, the bear lifted its head, nostrils flaring as it fixed its black eyes on her. She fired a flare into the sky, hoping the sudden burst of light would startle it. The bear hesitated, lifting its weight, but instead of retreating, it let out a guttural growl and advanced. The air filled with panicked voices as the rest of the team scrambled out of their tents. Tuktu shouted warnings, urging them not to run, but instinct overrode logic. The bear lunged, closing the distance faster than any of them anticipated. Dr. Moore barely had time to react before the beast was upon her. She attempted to dodge, but its massive paw struck her, knocking her to the ground. A scream tore through the night as the bear clamped its jaws around her shoulder, dragging her through the snow. Blood stained the pristine ice as her team desperately tried to intervene. Elias fired a flare directly at the bear's face. It recoiled, releasing its grip for a brief moment, but the damage had already been done. Rachel lay still, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ingrid and Jules rushed to her side, pressing futilely against the wound. Tuktu, rifle in hand, hesitated. Killing the bear was the last resort, an action that Inuit culture considered a failure in understanding nature's balance. But this was no ordinary encounter. This was survival. With a deafening crack, the rifle fired. The bear stumbled, a crimson spray marking the snow, but it did not go down immediately. It roared in pain, lashing out blindly before lumbering away into the darkness. The damage had been done. Rachel's wounds were deep, too deep for the rudimentary medical supplies they carried. Ingrid whispered urgent reassurances as they tried to stop the bleeding, but Rachel's breathing grew shallow. Her fingers, already pale from the cold, twitched slightly before going still. The weight of her loss settled over the team like the Arctic night itself. The shock, the grief, it was paralyzing. No one spoke as they carried her body back to the tent. The radio crackled as Jules desperately called for emergency evacuation, but the response was grim. The nearest rescue team was more than a day away, and with the storm brewing on the horizon, even that estimate was uncertain. By dawn, the decision was clear. The mission was over. The data, the research, the samples, they meant nothing now. The only priority was getting Rachel's body out of the Arctic before the ice claimed her entirely. The team dismantled the camp in silence, their movements mechanical, their minds trapped in the events of the night before. When the evacuation team finally arrived, they found the researchers pale and haggard, their faces etched with exhaustion and sorrow. Rachel's body was wrapped carefully in thermal blankets, ready for transport. No one spoke as they boarded the helicopter, leaving behind the frozen wasteland that had become their nightmare. Months later, as the team regrouped in a warm conference room far from the ice fields, they reviewed the data they had managed to salvage. Climate change had driven the Arctic's apex predator closer to human settlements, forcing desperate encounters like the one that had taken Rachel's life. It was a sobering reminder that the wilderness was not theirs to control, only to understand. Dr. Rachel Moore's name would be etched into scientific journals and memorial plaques, but for those who had been there, she was more than just a statistic in an environmental crisis. She was a colleague, a friend, and the unfortunate proof of what happened when the Arctic reminded them of its brutal, unwavering reality. In the summer of 2010, deep in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, 3 college friends, Ethan Thornfield, Mia Vexley, and Luke Drager, embarked on a hiking expedition meant to be the adventure of a lifetime. Alaska, with its sprawling wilderness, towering peaks, and rugged terrain, had long been a beacon for those seeking the thrill of untamed nature. The trio, all students from the University of Washington, had meticulously planned their trip, ensuring they had the necessary gear, permits, and provisions. However, they were woefully unprepared for the brutal lesson nature was about to teach them. Their journey began smoothly. The first day was filled with laughter and admiration for the breathtaking landscape. They followed a well-trodden trail that meandered through thick forests and led them to a vast open ridge where the land unfurled in an awe-inspiring panorama of endless green and snow-capped mountains. They set up camp by a quiet river, reveling in the crisp, unpolluted air. The night passed uneventfully, save for the distant howl of wolves, which only added to the raw beauty of the experience. By the second day, their enthusiasm remained high, though fatigue had begun to creep in. They trekked up a steep incline that rewarded them with a view straight out of a nature documentary. The ridge overlooked a sweeping valley below, where a winding river carved its way through the wilderness. The sun, though partially obscured by thick clouds, cast a golden glow over the landscape. It was the perfect spot for a group selfie. Ezekiel, the self-proclaimed photographer of the group, fished out his phone. Luke stretched his arms, exhausted, while Marlo, always eager to document their journey, adjusted her beanie and grinned at the camera. As Ethan positioned the phone, something rustled in the bushes to their left. The noise was faint but noticeable enough to make Luke glance over his shoulder. At first, it seemed insignificant, a mere shift in the undergrowth caused by the wind. But then, the rustling grew louder. Twigs snapped. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Ethan and Luke exchanged uneasy glances. Before they could react further, a massive grizzly bear emerged from the dense thicket. The bear was a monstrous sight, standing nearly 10 feet tall on its hind legs before dropping down onto all fours. Its shaggy coat was matted with dirt, and its eyes were dark and unreadable. The sheer bulk of the animal sent a jolt of terror through the trio. They had read about bear encounters, but nothing truly prepared a person to see one up close. Luke instinctively took a step back. Ethan clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. Marlo, however, had an entirely different reaction. Instead of retreating, she lifted her phone, angling the camera toward the bear. The absurdity of the moment didn't register until it was too late. Mia edged forward in a bizarre mix of awe and reckless curiosity, attempting to capture the perfect shot. It happened in an instant. The bear, perhaps startled by the movement, let out a guttural huff and lunged, a blur of motion, a flash of claws, a scream. The impact sent Mia sprawling backward, her phone flung into the air before landing with a crack on the rocky ground. Blood splattered the uneven terrain as deep gashes tore through her jacket and into her flesh. Her left arm was ripped open, and her thigh bore a savage wound. Pain shot through her body in waves, but panic muffled her ability to process it. Ethan and Luke reacted on pure instinct. They shouted, waving their arms in desperate attempts to deter the bear. Luke, remembering the bear spray strapped to his backpack, fumbled to unclip it. His fingers trembled as he pulled it free, but the bear had already taken a second swipe at Mia by the time he aimed, sending her rolling down the incline. Ethan grabbed a rock, hurling it at the bear's head. It struck the animal's snout, not injuring it but irritating it enough for the grizzly to pause. That was all the time Luke needed. He pressed the nozzle, releasing a concentrated burst of bear spray. The orange cloud enveloped the bear's face. It roared, shaking its massive head, before finally turning and retreating into the brush. Silence followed, broken only by Marlo's ragged breaths. Blood seeped into the dirt as she clutched her wounds. The gravity of what had just occurred sank in quickly. The adrenaline that had momentarily numbed the pain began to wear off, and her face twisted in agony. Ethan and Luke scrambled down to her. Her arm was a mess of torn flesh, and the gash on her thigh made movement excruciating. They didn't have time to waste. The wilderness was vast, and help was miles away. Ripping a section of his shirt, Ethan fashioned a makeshift tourniquet to slow the bleeding. Luke assessed their options. They were too far from the ranger station to call for immediate help, and their satellite phone was still in camp, a mistake they now deeply regretted. Their only choice was to get Mia moving. They half-carried, half-dragged her back onto the trail, their hearts pounding as they glanced over their shoulders, fearing the bear might return. Each step was an agonizing ordeal for Mia, but she gritted her teeth, forcing herself forward. Hours passed, and the once thrilling adventure was now reduced to a desperate struggle for survival. By the time they reached their camp, the sun was setting, and Marlo's condition was worsening. The blood loss had left her pale and weak. Ethan fumbled with the satellite phone, his hands slick with sweat. When he finally managed to contact the park rangers, his voice was barely steady enough to relay their location. It took another 2 hours before a rescue team arrived. The rangers worked swiftly, stabilizing Mia before airlifting her to the nearest hospital. As she was loaded into the helicopter, she weakly gestured toward Ezekiel's phone, a ghost of a smirk on her lips. It wasn't lost on them that despite the harrowing experience, part of her still wanted to see the picture she had risked everything for. The aftermath of the attack left scars, both physical and psychological. Mia spent months in recovery, undergoing surgeries and rehabilitation. The incident became a cautionary tale among their friends, a grim reminder that nature was not to be taken lightly. The once exciting idea of capturing the perfect selfie now carried a much darker weight. Ethan and Luke never returned. Their love for hiking remained, but their approach had forever changed. They understood now that nature was not meant to be conquered or molded for the sake of a photo. It was to be respected. As for Marlowe, she never quite lost her adventurous spirit, but whenever she saw a camera, she remembered the day a single photo nearly cost her life.